Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the International Centre Goa for today's program, which is the first of its kind that we are doing. This is something we are trying out, where we focus. We'll talk about the books that are here on my table, but we'll also focus a bit more than we do in other programs on the author, on the writer. Okay, so Narayani, it's a pleasure to have you here with us in Goa. Narayani is the author of 3 books. I think there's a 4th one as well, which was on a different subject, foreign policy. And the 2 most well-known books are, of course, the biography of V.P. Menon and the newer one, which is K.M. Panekar's biography. And I've been thinking of calling her since she wrote the V.P. Menon biography. But then Goa does not have the kind of audience that, say, perhaps Delhi has, the IIC kind of mahal.
I mean, to be fair, it was also a pandemic year. It was lockdown.
Right,
so
right.
You get
so I was
off the hook
why?
there.
Because her name has been on my mind for a while, that Narayani ko lana hai and all that, but it never happened. And so finally, and then between a second book has come out, bigger, fatter than the first one, but that may be completely due to the font size and things like that. But both are fantastic reads. And I was talking to Narayani earlier, so that's the quick introduction. Narayani is the biographer of K.M. Panekar and V.P. Menon, 2 stalwarts, whose lives begin in pre-independent India during the British period and go on to post-independent India, where they played substantial roles in the formation and the development of post-independent India. And I was talking to Diane earlier, and he said, look, how did it all begin? Because all of you know of Ramchandra Guha, Ram Guha as is known as. I said, look, I recall something that he had written about a few years ago, The Makers of Modern India, which is on the lives of 19 individuals who played substantial roles in pre-independent India. And so I asked her, look, and this is what I'm going to ask her now, that where did it begin, the whole idea of writing about, actually the 2 books are on important people from, the first half of, say, the mid-20th century onwards. And I have to mention her 3rd book, or the 3rd biography which is coming out, somebody whom most of us in this room will relate to far more easily, T.N. Session. Because everyone, I was in college, I think I was in JNU at that time, and Session came and changed everything, right? Every day it would be, literally every day, Session in the news, pulling up errant politicians and parties and for something. And everyone said, my God, this is a defining moment for India. This position existed, and this man has changed what this position means. Anyway, so that's a 3rd book. But Narayani, let's begin with, how did it all begin, writing on these 2 biographies? Or obviously the first one was something which you might have thought of earlier, and did this mahal, larger mahal of where Ramchandra Guha is now actually for a few years now, they have been working at getting biographies of important individuals in post-independent India or even pre-independent India, getting people to commission. He's commissioning people to write these biographies, and I think it's really, really important. I'm not sure how many people actually read the whole book, But when you see this book at the airport, everybody gets to know a name usually, and I think that's a start, is it not? The current generation has less to do with these figures than we do. So there is now, over the last 10-15 years, a greater effort on the part of independent writers, a greater effort on the part of publishers. There's also a growing market, it seems. It's not large, but there are people who want to read biographies. So the original question, how did it begin?
Began actually from a desire to make people go, the reaction that T.N. Session's name got, these people do not get. But flippancy aside, it was about, I would say, 2014 that I actually began researching VP Menon. And, I mean, full disclosure, VP Menon was a very personal endeavor also. I am his great-granddaughter. And it was something that I wanted to document. There was nothing that was Googleable, should I say, right? Like, he'd written these 2 seminal books on the integration of the Indian states and the transfer of power. And both of them are incredibly seminal, but also incredibly, due respect to the man, but they're incredibly boring because they're just facts. You go from point A to point B to point C. It gave me no insight into the context, into the color, into the people he was dealing with, into the personalities he was dealing with. None of that was on the page. And I really couldn't find anything on the internet about him. And so I was working as a foreign policy analyst at that point. I was working at a think tank called the Institute for Peace and Conflict Studies in Delhi. I was very bored. I was in my mid-20s at the time. And I was telling Pushkar this earlier. I told my mother that, this is something that I want to document. I am a history student. I have been trained in this. This is something that I want to document. And at that point, she was very clear. And she said, look, by all means, follow your dreams, but, you're going to have to do this on your own. And at that point, biographies were not, forget biographies. It wasn't even something that you could think of doing professionally, as a full-time historian who was not affiliated, and I'm still not affiliated to any university. So I really had to start from scratch. And it was this whole journey through the National Archives, through private papers, all of which I talk about with great ease today. But in 2014, it was a maze, honestly, to discover somebody who I only knew as the secretary to Sardar Patel. I only knew the part of his life where he was secretary to the Ministry of States, where he had played an incredibly instrumental role in the integration of the Indian states. I didn't know anything more about this man. And I had to really, really dig to find out where he was in the archives even, right? Because this is what happens when you're documenting an independence movement or a really pivotal moment in any kind of history. What tends to take center stage is the household names, the main people that you think of when you think of a pivotal moment in history. So in our case, it was Jawaharlal Nehru, it was Sardar Patel, it was Gandhi, it was these incredibly huge figures. The other thing that I was finding was that you don't think of a bureaucrat when you're thinking of moments like this. You are not looking behind the scenes of what is happening center stage. Because a revolution like this, a moment like this, is not just about the kind of speeches that are being made. It's not just about the faces and sort of symbols of this movement, all of which are incredibly important in their own right. But I found that there hasn't been, and there wasn't, much attention being paid to what was happening behind the scenes of that. How do you legitimize a movement like this? How do you crystallize it? What is the kind of paperwork that goes into, and paperwork is, actually speaking, the less talked about aspect of moments like these, right? It is actually what makes up the nuts and bolts of a nation. You have to have people behind the scenes who are doing the grunt work, who are doing the legwork. It takes a lot of effort to maintain the people that you see on stage. There's a lot of work that goes into that. And that is what I found with VP Menon's story, and it's an incredible story. This is a boy who runs away from home after, and completely very pampered boy from Kerala, runs away from home after setting his school on fire, which is something I always dreamed about doing, and then works for a while in the gold mines in Kolar and sort of hopscotches his way across to Delhi and ultimately to Simla. He starts his career, and I'm really condensing this, right? He starts his career as a typist in the Home Department, and from there he works his way up. He's never sat for the ICS examinations. He was not a civil servant per se. And the only point at which I found him in the National Archives was this thin file, which had just this one scrap of paper where he'd applied to extend his appointment in the Home Department as a typist, and this was when the First World War had broken out. And that's when I found that he had been in within the walls of the Imperial Secretariat from 1914, right? That's 1914 to 1951. That's the whole swathe of the independence movement. So this was a man who was not just secretary to the Ministry of States. This was a man who then goes on to join the Reforms branch, which is an incredibly important branch under the Home Department. And that he stayed there for the duration of his career. He was also Reforms Commissioner to our last 3 viceroys. And the scope of that career, that has gone so completely by the way almost, right? And during this career, he did so many things, not just the integration of the states. He also drafted the Instrument of Accession as early as 1937. He had to do most of the legwork for Sardar Patel, because in the last years of his life, Sardar Patel was a very sick man. So if you see the Instruments of Accession, the signature on them is that of V.P. Menon. So this is somebody who did so much for this country completely off stage. And I think when I was working on this is when it sort of became my, I don't want to say mission because that just sounds sanctimonious, but it just became something that I wanted to do. I wanted to tell the kind of stories that would remind not just me, but other people that there's so much more that happens off stage of a huge moment in history. And there are people who play incredibly pivotal roles behind the scenes as well, which is why K.M. Panikkar also came in. So I encountered him while I was researching V.P. Menon. And as a foreign policy analyst, I'd sort of heard of him only in the capacity of, okay, he was our ambassador and our most controversial ambassador to China. And he was the guy who was responsible for messing things up as far as bilateral relations between India and China were concerned. While I was researching V.P. Menon, I found him in another capacity. I found him in the role of secretary to the Chamber of Princes. Now, the Chamber of Princes was this consultative body, essentially, that was set up to negotiate for more leeway between the princely states and the Raj. And my question at that point was, how did this guy, who was our ambassador, what was he doing there? And how did he come there? What was the trajectory from the Chamber of Princes to China? Right? What were the roles that this man played? And when I then researched K.M. Panikkar, which is why the book is the size it is, he did so much. He was not just a diplomat. He served 3 princely states. He served Kashmir, Patiala, and Bikaner. He was secretary to the Chamber of Princes, during which time he pushed for federalism as one of our earliest constitutional models. He was a poet. He was a writer of Malayalam fiction. He was professor of history at Aligarh Muslim University. He was a lawyer by training. This man was present also during the swathe of our independence movement. Very different capacities, very unconventional career. He was also present for the first 2 decades of our existence as a post-colonial country. Right? So he was not only Nehru's man in China, he was Nehru's man in Egypt, he was Nehru's man in France, he was a member of the States Reorganization Commission. Again, hugely pivotal, barely remembered in sort of piecemeal ways. If you're a lawyer, you would have heard of K.M. Panikkar. If you have been in the foreign services, you would know of K.M. Panikkar. But objectively speaking, is there something that pulls his life story together? No. And yet again, such a completely important figure, which is why I chose Panikkar as my next after V.P. Menon. T.N. Seshan, of course, came from a very different motive. That is a co-authored book, and it will be co-authored by a good friend of mine, a journalist by the name of Abhishek Mehrotra. We were talking about the Election Commission, and this was at the time when West Bengal was sort of going through this controversial 8-stage election phase. And I had just done an op-ed for the Indian Express on the Election Commission and how it was just a very toothless institution at that point. T.N. Seshan obviously cropped up. And the more I read about him, the more, it baffled me that there wasn't anything written about this man who actually made the Election Commission what it is, who was not afraid to speak truth to power, who was also extremely arrogant, a bit of a megalomaniac, And yet, the recall value of T.N. Seshan is so immense. I mean, all of you sat up when T.N. Seshan's name was mentioned, and that's for a reason. And honestly, that book felt equally timely, but in a very different sense. It felt like this was a story that needed to be told to sort of remind ourselves that this is what institutions used to be, and this is what could be done. In fact, all three men in very different capacities have spoken truth to power and have held up institutions. So in a sense, yes, I guess T.N. Seshan, though he was very much at the forefront of everything in his day, equally pivotal.
The last 2 decades, one gets the sense that the writing of biographies, at least in the Indian context, has matured, or at least is evolving and has reached a point where we can say, and it doesn't matter whether it's written in English or not, but compared to, say, 30, 40 years ago, where biographies published in the 70s, 80s, 90s, I think there has been a big shift in how our writers, our academics too, approach, not so much academics, I think popular writers, people, how they approach a subject. I mean, earlier it was all about saying good things about X, Y, Z. In fact, X, Y was the person who was, paying a certain amount of money to write a book, and the 2 or 3 big publishers, Jayco or Rupa had come by then, and 2 or 3 others which would publish the book, and everyone went home happy. And you picked up a book and you said, what a great man or what a great woman this was, and his or her contributions to the country, to the company, to whatever else, amazing. And then somewhere maybe about the beginning of the 21st century, a shift starts to happen. I don't know with whom, or with one book or with a series of books. And we started to, look at public figures or even lesser known figures, and we started to write about them, warts and all. I mean, good things, bad things, and so biographies, as you understand them, when you read a biography written in 1960s about an American politician or somebody, unless it was commissioned for that specific purpose, to sing praises, it would always have that kind of balance. I mean, there would be no, you would not be emotionally attached to the goodness or badness of a character. So, where do you think this change started to happen, and is it something to which some kind of conscious attempt started to be made? I'm not sure when it did and with whose writings.
I think it's just begun out of this collective search for knowing more about the people who were very instrumental in our history, whether it was pre-colonial or post-colonial. I think there is a great curiosity about people who have made history, and essentially that's been my motivation as a biographer, because I believe that history is deeply interlinked with human nature as well. So much of history is caused by who's got a feud with whom, whose personality rubs somebody the wrong way, egos, jealousies, rivalries, great loves, all of those things. They sound incredibly romantic when you put it like that, but it's honestly, that is what makes history, essentially. And I believe that when you're telling, especially with a biography, there has been this tendency in this country to write sort of hagiographies, eulogies almost, to the people that you're writing about. That, I believe, does no service to the person that you're writing about. I believe that if you are writing about somebody, and this is irrespective of whether I'm writing about my great-grandfather, whether I'm writing about K.M. Panikkar, to whom I'm not related at all, I do believe that they need to be presented in totality, or in as much totality as you can build based on archival evidence and based on interviews. That is the purpose of a true biography, is to put a person in context to not only the times they were living in, but the overall context in which they were living in. And I think if you can sort of achieve that, then you've written somewhere near a good biography. I hate the word comprehensive. I hate the word definitive. I don't see any biography, whether it's mine or anyone else's, as definitive or comprehensive. But the closest you can do is to paint as good a portrait and as detailed a portrait of human nature as possible, and set it against the context of the politics and geopolitics of their day and their time. So I think over the years there has been a greater sort of push to understand more factual based narratives, more evidence based narratives, especially as there's been this sort of surge of what's known as WhatsApp histories in this day and age of social media especially. There's been a greater search for knowing what is true. And I think that is somewhere where there's a greater hunger to know about people like a V.P. Menon and a K.M. Panikkar. There's a greater desire to pick up books like this and say, okay, who are these people and okay, what did they do? And I think that's incredibly important when you're looking to write biographies as well. I think right now where things still need to be improved upon, should I say, is these biographies are just in English, right? Translations are really hard to do. You need to pay for them yourself as an author. They're not always affordable. You need to make biographies. Not only do you need to make biographies accessible to everybody in all vernaculars, but there needs to be a space for biographies written in the vernacular as well. Because there are so many local heroes and local people who need to be written about, right? There also needs to be more, and I'm completely guilty of this as well since I've written about 3 men, but there needs to be more biographies on women. We had some remarkable women, whether it's C.B. Muthamma, whether it is Hansa Mehta, so many incredible women who have not been written about, who have not had merited full-length books in their own right, and everybody needs to read about these women, because it wasn't just men who built this country, it was women also.
Or men often did it on the backs of women.
Absolutely.
We are starting to see some correction maybe in that regard. I mean, in the sense that I know of a couple of books on women who were involved in writing the Constitution.
Yes, yeah.
And so on. So we are seeing some correction.
There's
still
some
slow, but I think that could be the next wave phase.
I certainly hope it is.
Where we move away from the important men. And there's also an important book published by Gyan Pandey recently
Yes.
on, which should at least, something which happens in academic circles, not always, but sometimes it does influence what happens outside that. So journalists and others. So one can be hopeful that, Gyan Pandey's book, very well-known historian, his book might push the envelope in that direction. Narayani, the other thing that I was thinking is, again, ICG has been very, very fortunate to actually hosted, not just as for a book discussion or otherwise, at least 3-4 people who have written important biographies in the last few years. So, for example, we had, you would have seen the book on Vajpayee's biography at airports, definitely, 2 volumes of it. So Abhishek Chaudhary, the person who wrote those 1,000 pages, he spent a month here as a scholar in residence on editing those 1,000 pages. But other than that, 2 years ago we had Akshay Mukul, who was invited to the Lit Fest. I invited him, because I said, look, this is an important book, and he had already gotten this award, Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay Award, which is probably, I think, certainly the most prestigious award one can win for that kind of writing. And then last year we had Aparajit Ramnath, whose book on Vishvesvaraya, Vishwish Marega, and we're talking about how difficult it is for both of us to get the name right at the first go. So I invited him for the Lit Fest, and that book remarkably has won the 2025 Kamla Devi Chattopadhyay Award about a month ago. So I'm sort of thrilled that I have been able to get some remarkable. And then the veteran journalist Sanjay Hazarika, he's writing a biography of again I forget the name, Mizoram's first chief minister. That will be published next year. He recently sent me an email. The book is done, dusted, and now with the final edits, it will be out in about February, March. So so I'm really happy that we have biographers, and some of the big ones actually, and you count as one of them, Narayani.
Thank you.
So coming to the center. But I wanted to get to a more boring topic, at least I think from an audience's point of view. Many of us don't understand what the writing process is,
Right.
what it involves. I mean, research of any kind, whether for academics or whether for someone like you who is outside academia. And if one was actually writing a biography of somebody who lived 50 years ago or 100 years ago, what does it involve? And I think, just very quickly, what kind of labor is involved? It's a labor of love, but, of putting everything in, the minutest details. A friend of mine once told me that he's most comfortable in basements where you have the smell of paper everywhere and you are pulling out files which if you do it very quickly or something might tear, that kind of thing. And he was a political scientist, but he loved the archives. I don't. So,
Not many people love the archives. When I started out in the archives, I didn't love them either. The one thing that you're not taught, which is something that is being rectified, at least in private universities in Delhi, I can't speak for everywhere, but we were not taught how to use the archives. We were not taught how to investigate the archives, and that was just true for not just undergrad but postgrad as well. So when I started researching V.P. Menon, I was at 6s and 7s honestly, because the National Archives of India is this huge government building. You enter its maw and you're genuinely just lost, because there are huge ledgers that and they're those old-fashioned red leather-bound ledgers, and you have to sort of sit down with them and go through them, and they all cross-referenced year-wise, subject-wise. You have to know exactly what you're looking for, and even then there's no great surety that you'll find what you're looking for. So once you master this whole thing of filling out requisition slips, figuring out when to submit them, how many to submit, you get told off by the archivist many times about submitting the wrong reference. You filled it in the wrong way, so you have to refill it in, so it's a whole other mess. Many of these files, and I wish I was kidding when I said this, but many of these files, when I submitted them and the archivist came back to me, it was just like, nahi bandar leke gaye hain, because the files are stocked in a repository at the top of the building, and the National Archives has a lot of monkeys, and the windows were left open, and some monkeys came in and went off with the files. And I'm not making this up. I really wish I was, but I'm really not. So not only do you have to deal with monkeys coming in, you also have to deal with requisition slips being returned with the words NT on top, and any scholar who's in the National Archives will begin to dread the words NT, because NT means not transferred, which means that they have not been transferred from the ministry that they originated from, right? They will be mentioned in the index though. So you're just like, but then why hasn't it been, who do I contact? There's no one you can contact. So you're just left with this requisition slip saying NT, and it's staring inexorably at you, and you don't know what to do with that, because without that file, your research cannot progress, because that file actually has the piece of information that will take you to the next step in that journey of yours. So then you have to figure out a way to go around that file and figure out some other way to get information. And when you're researching bureaucrats, it's mind-blowing, because they're not easy to pin down, because you can't locate them anywhere. They exist in the margins of files. They exist, in little memos somewhere which have their initials, and they've been overwritten by various people, so you're just like, this memo also doesn't make sense without that file that you can't find. So once you've mastered all of that, and even now a decade later, I'm really still not a master, because the other thing that you will come up against is, inevitably when you're writing a biography, you need private papers, because you need letters that they may have written to people, people may have written to them. So you go into the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, which is now the Prime Minister's Museum and Library, and they have this wonderful manuscript section where there's private papers. Many of them have not been released because embargoes. For instance, R.N. Kaus, who was our great spy master, oversaw the annexation of Sikkim. His papers are embargoed till 2027. So if you want to write, and there have been books that have been written about R.N. Kaus, but how have they been written without access to those papers? Those are his personal papers. So it's stuff like that. It's like when you're looking at the Jawaharlal Nehru papers in the NMML, there is a huge section of Jawaharlal Nehru's private papers. Again, those have been heavily sanitized. There are parts of this that are not accessible, or that have been redacted, or that have been removed. So at any given time, when you're writing about a certain period in history, how much of it are you able to write without access to the archives? You're writing, I'm certainly writing about people who deal with paperwork, etc., but there's no paperwork sometimes, because all of it is either not transferred, or it's embargoed, or it's just not there, right? So if you're writing about, say, Kashmir, or you're writing about China, you're writing about Tibet, a lot of that information is not there, right? So it's because why national security, right? If you go to the cartography section, and I've had friends of mine who face this problem, cartography section at the National Archives of India, because if you're writing books that require old maps, say the Durand Line, you can't access those maps. Why? Because national security. It's the Durand Line, it's a 19th century construct, but you cannot access it because national security, right? So there's a number of blockages to writing history in this country that makes it very difficult, irrespective of whether you're just writing history per se, or whether you're writing biographies of people, because certainly V.P. Menon, K.M. Panikkar all functioned within very febrile times, right? Events were changing minute by minute, hour by hour practically. These were men who had to deal with that kind of pressure. These were men also who had to make sense of events as they were unfolding minute by minute and second by second. Without that kind of documentation, without the kind of understanding of the importance of that documentation, it's very difficult to write history. The other thing that I came up against was also a complete lack of understanding around oral history and what that means, which led to a huge controversy around the V.P. Menon book in particular, because while I was researching it, I came across V.P. Menon's last interview that he had given to H.V. Hodgson, who was our Reforms Commissioner and was V.P. Menon's superior. And these two men became incredibly close friends. And when H.V. Hodgson was researching his own book on his time in India called The Great Divide, he had come out to spend some time with V.P. Menon. And he had recorded V.P. Menon's entire life story. And I found those recordings in SOAS, where they still are. I went and listened to them. They had not been digitized, so I had to physically go there. And there's a particular moment on those recordings where he's basically talking about the first draft of the cabinet list. And he's writing about this complete blow-up that happened behind the scenes, where Nehru and Patel were at loggerheads, and Patel had been left off the first draft of the cabinet list. And so V.P. Menon goes to Mountbatten and says, okay, this cannot be the case. Patel has to be on the first cabinet list. The first cabinet list, as we all know, does have Patel on it, the eventual published draft. But I included this recollection of V.P. Menon simply because, for me, this was a man who was in the room on many important conversations. it was also the fact that we tend to forget that when we're writing about politics, when we're writing about geopolitics and diplomacy, some of the key decisions are not documented decisions. Most of diplomacy happens on the sidelines of big meetings. Most of diplomacy is not recorded in official minutes or meetings. That's actually where you need to remember that stories are made. And as somebody who is writing about a man who was in the room for key moments and key events, it seemed not right to leave out that memory. That memory, of course, got blown out of all proportion by political parties because, of the times we live in. In itself, in this book, it's about 3 lines in a 400-page book, right? So, which is how completely, some politics can derail something as simple as a man remembering what was happening behind the scenes of a moment as incredible as the transfer of power, right? I have always felt very strongly about oral history simply because we tend to forget the fact that the experiences of people who have been in key rooms of power, of discussion, those are incredibly important as well. Do they come with a certain amount of bias? Yes, but then all history has a certain amount of bias. I don't believe in leaving it off the record simply because it might ruffle a few feathers. So these are all the things that I had to sort of learn from scratch while I was writing all of these books, essentially speaking. So it was a lot of labor, should I say.
I just have a couple of quick questions, and then we'll open the for questions. And these are fun questions. I mean, so 2, 3 biographies that you can immediately think of that you would count as phenomenal masterpieces, kind of thing.
I recently read this biography by Selena Hastings of W. Somerset Maugham. I grew up reading Somerset Maugham because my parents love him. And she's written this very no-holds-barred biography about this guy who was incredibly, apart from being a writer of novels, he was also a spy at some point during the Second World War, and it's a very cool biography. Mary Lovell's biography of the Mitford girls, it's a group biography, and I've always been very interested in how do you write a biography of a group, whether it's a family or whether it's a group of people. I've never done that as yet. And so the art of it was something that was very interesting.
Biographers. There are people who write biographies all their life, right? I mean, so I don't know, when I was a kid, one of the things I did was read some biographies at that time. And I remember Irving Stone, somebody who wrote a biography of Michelangelo and Charles Darwin and others. I mean, that's the name I recall from many, many years ago. But surely there are people who have made it a business to write biographies. I mean, you're on the same road.
I think honestly the best biography that I've read in recent times has been Abhishek's biography of Vajpayee. I thought the first volume in particular was something that I absolutely couldn't put down because it opened my eyes to a whole new side of not just Vajpayee but of the independence movement also. So I think his 2 biographies on Vajpayee have been incredibly wonderful readings, and really I was just blown away by the neutrality and objectivity that he brought to it, and I wish I could write like that also. But the other one is Patrick French, who wrote some really great biographies. His one on V.S. Naipaul particularly stood out to me because he had this condition with V.S. Naipaul, and it's also, he wrote it while V.S. Naipaul was still alive. And he went to V.S. Naipaul and he said, look, I can only write this if you give me complete and utter access to your correspondence, with the diaries of your first wife, everything. I want this. I will only write this if you allow me a complete and utter free hand with this, which I think is superb. And the result is a book that is phenomenal. Like, it's still one of my top 3 biographies.
upset many people once after it was published. I mean,
Yeah.
there's some debate about whether
Huge
he
debate.
should
I
have
mean,
done
look
it.
at the man you're writing about also.
Yeah. Because that sort of, is about this last question, and then we'll go to the audience, which is, I remember having a conversation with someone about the Vajpayee book, Abhishek Chaudhary's biography of Vajpayee. And I said, look, he's been here, he was here for a month, and he was doing great work, and I'm so happy that the book is out and doing well. And the person who is also sort of writes about people, he said, when you write biographies, when you do these things, you should write good things. And, and he said that, what was the need to expose Vajpayee? I mean, but maybe it's sort of a, not generational thing. I'm talking about somebody who's more or less my generation. But I found it odd, but I don't know how, I didn't know how to answer that question. But, the first thing that came to my mind is, so we should not be writing a biography of Churchill. I mean, in that manner, right? I mean, you can just about exclude every hero, villain you can think of. And, how does even one respond to this kind of a thing about? So that's why I said, the last many years, decade or so has been phenomenal from that point of view. Wonderful biographies, very balanced, detailed. Mistakes, that's fine. There can be mistakes in interpretation somewhere, and there's so many gaps.
Yeah, but it also then opens up space for good debate, which I think is beginning to sorely lack in this country.
And maybe somebody will come up with information about.
Yeah, I mean, no biography is a full biography, and you should allow space for both different interpretations of the archives and of history, as well as engaging with those different interpretations. That's the only way that we can progress with understanding our past.
I know, and this is, I won't name names, but somebody was telling me that one very influential book in English, which ran into several editions, was going to be translated into a regional language. So in the process of translation, once you start translating, these people also had a bunch of researchers for fact-checking. So it didn't matter that the person who had written the original book was a famous writer. These guys, when they were doing the translation, their team looked at the whole book, all 600 pages of it, they fact-checked it. And then they got back to the author and said, look, we have found X number of mistakes, there are more than a dozen. And the author's response was, great, they can be corrected. But that is exactly how one goes about. When you put something out in the open, somebody says this is from the archives and this is great work. There's always be some part of the story which is left out, some note which has been lost, something which was discussed unofficially never made it to the notes, right?
Yeah.
And then you have to depend on who told a more credible story in their autobiographies. Right? So really, so biographies we are, I think, just quickly sum up, biographies we are living in a time where we can look forward to a bunch of new biographies, some very good ones. So I'll just mention one because we are in Goa. We have a biography of the great D.D. Kosambi coming up over the next 12 months, sometime by the end of next year. D.D. Kosambi's father, Dharmanand Kosambi, lived in, where's that area behind, just before Bits? I'm forgetting the name of the village. No. Sangkwal, right, Sangkwal. So his ancestral house is there in ruins. His niece was at the center 2 days ago. She's staying at the Panjim Inn. She's trying to put things together. I was going through some very, very old photographs, and she smiled and she said, well, Ram found them for me. They are from the archives at Harvard University, and something is from somewhere, some cousin somewhere, and so on and so forth. But the D.D. Kosambi biography is something I'm looking forward to. And his father's biography, Dharmanand Kosambi's biography, that is Ram Ramaswamy's great project, the next one. So you have people who are now in the business of, if you want to put it very succinctly, business of writing biographies. Narayani, congratulations, you're part of the gang.
Thank you.